What if the next economic collapse is not an accident? What if the crashes, the inflation spikes, the bank failures, and the sudden market panics are not simply the result of bad luck, bad policy, or unpredictable crises? What if, instead, they follow a pattern? A pattern that has appeared again and again throughout history. A pattern where powerful financial institutions, governments, and central banks create the conditions for a massive boom, knowing full well that a devastating bust will eventually follow. And when that bust arrives, ordinary people lose their savings, their homes, and their jobs. But the same powerful institutions that helped create the crisis somehow emerge even more powerful. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but history tells a very different story. Because if you trace the origins of modern financial crises, the evidence suggests something far more disturbing. Welcome to its financial history too. To understand this pattern, we need to go back to the foundations of the modern financial system. In the early 20th century, global economies were chaotic. Bank runs were common. Markets crashed frequently. Governments struggled to control financial panic. Then came a solution that was supposed to stabilize everything: central banking. Central banks were designed to act as lenders of last resort, controlling money supply and stabilizing markets during crises. In theory, this system would prevent collapses. But over time, something strange began happening. Instead of eliminating economic crises, the system began producing bigger and bigger bubbles. And each bubble followed the same sequence. First came easy money. Central banks lowered interest rates, making borrowing cheap. Banks began lending aggressively. Governments encouraged spending. Asset prices, stocks, real estate, commodities began rising rapidly. At first, the growth looked healthy. But under the surface, something dangerous was happening. Debt was exploding. Households borrowed more. Corporations borrowed more. Governments borrowed more. The entire system became dependent on cheap money and constant growth. Then came the second phase: speculation. Investors rushed into markets chasing fast profits. People began buying assets not because they were valuable, but because they expected prices to keep rising. This happened during the roaring 1920s. It happened again during the housing boom of the early 2000s. And today, many analysts believe it is happening again in global markets. But the third phase is where the pattern becomes truly destructive. Eventually, central banks start raising interest rates. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Debt becomes harder to repay. And suddenly, the entire system begins to crack. Asset prices stop rising. Speculators panic. Banks begin tightening credit. What once looked like unstoppable growth suddenly turns into a chain reaction of collapse. We saw this during the Great Depression. After years of easy credit in the 1920s, the stock market crash of 1929 triggered a massive economic collapse. Banks failed. Businesses shut down. Unemployment soared to devastating levels. Millions lost everything. But the cycle did not end there. Decades later, a similar pattern emerged again. In the early 2000s, central banks kept interest rates extremely low. Banks began issuing massive amounts of mortgage loans. Many of these loans were risky. But Wall Street found a way to package these loans into complex financial products and sell them around the world. For years, housing prices kept rising. It seemed like a perfect system. Until it wasn't. In 2007, cracks began appearing. Borrowers started defaulting. Mortgage-backed securities began losing value. And suddenly, the entire financial system was in danger. The result was the global financial crisis of 2008. Banks collapsed. Markets crashed. Governments were forced to launch massive bailout programs. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. While millions of people lost homes, jobs, and savings, the largest financial institutions received enormous rescue packages. Governments injected trillions of dollars into banks to stabilize the system. Central banks printed unprecedented amounts of money. And in the years that followed, financial markets recovered faster than the real economy. Stock markets soared to record highs. Corporate profits exploded. But many ordinary families were still struggling. Wages stagnated. Living costs increased. And wealth inequality reached historic levels. Which brings us to the present day. Over the last decade, the global economy has experienced one of the largest monetary experiments in history. Following the 2008 crisis and the pandemic shock of 2020, central banks flooded the system with money. Interest rates were pushed close to zero. Trillions of dollars were created through stimulus programs and quantitative easing. Asset prices surged again. Stock markets climbed. Real estate prices skyrocketed. Cryptocurrency markets exploded. But once again, debt levels climbed to unprecedented levels. Global debt has now surpassed $300 trillion. That is more than 3 times the size of the global economy. And now, the same institutions that created the era of easy money are rapidly reversing course. Central banks are raising interest rates, liquidity is shrinking, and financial stress is beginning to appear across markets. Banks are facing new pressures. Corporate bankruptcies are rising. Governments are struggling with massive debt payments. And many economists fear the system may be approaching another breaking point. If that happens, the consequences could be severe. But here's the most disturbing part. After every crisis, the same pattern repeats. Stronger regulations are promised. New safeguards are introduced. Governments claim they have fixed the system, but over time, those safeguards weaken. Risk returns. Debt expands again. And the cycle begins all over. Boom, bubble, collapse, bailout, recovery, repeat. The question is not whether the cycle exists. History shows that it clearly does. The real question is why it keeps happening. Some economists argue it is simply human nature. Greed, optimism, and speculation push markets beyond sustainable limits. Others argue the system itself encourages risky behavior. When financial institutions believe they will be rescued during crises, they may take greater risks. This phenomenon is known as moral hazard, and it may explain why the same mistakes keep happening. But regardless of the cause, the consequences are very real. Economic collapses reshape societies. They change political systems. They redistribute wealth. And they determine who holds power in the financial world. So what can we learn from all of this? There are 3 major takeaways. First, economic booms driven by cheap money rarely last forever. When debt grows faster than the real economy, the system becomes fragile. Second, financial crises often follow predictable patterns. Understanding those patterns can help people recognize warning signs before a collapse occurs. And third, the institutions that shape financial systems often survive crises better than ordinary people. Which means individuals must take responsibility for understanding how the system works. Because the next crisis may not come with warning signs on the evening news. It may begin quietly. A few banks under stress, a sudden market correction. A credit freeze somewhere in the global system. Then suddenly, the dominoes begin falling. And when they do, the people who understood the pattern will be far better prepared than those who assumed the system was stable. So the real question is not just whether another crisis is coming. The real question is whether we will recognize the pattern before it happens again. If you found this video valuable, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping global finance. Because the story of money is never as simple as it looks.